The crisp autumn wind whistled through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, carrying with it the sweet, sorrowful notes of a violin. It was just another busy evening outside Trump Tower, with yellow cabs honking and busy New Yorkers rushing past, heads down, lost in their own worlds. The time was around 6:30 p.m., and the streetlights had just begun to flicker to life, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Former President Donald Trump had just finished a series of meetings and was heading to his car when something made him stop. Through the usual cacophony of city noise, a melody caught his ear, the haunting strains of Schubert's Ave Maria, played with such emotion that it seemed to rise above the urban chaos. Trump paused, his hand on the car door. His security detail exchanged confused glances, not used to this break in routine. Following the sound, Trump's eyes landed on an elderly man standing near the corner, his thin frame slightly bent over a violin that had clearly seen better days. The musician's clothes were clean but worn. A beige sweater with leather patches on the elbows, pressed gray slacks that had faded with time, and well-polished but old brown shoes. The thing that struck Trump most wasn't the man's apparent poverty, it was the pure dignity with which he played. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as if he were performing at Carnegie Hall rather than on a crowded street corner. A small cluster of people had gathered to listen, though few had dropped anything in the open violin case at his feet. As Trump watched, a young mother stopped with her little boy, who stood transfixed by the music. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in that carrying whisper that children use, "Mommy, why is the man playing out here? He's really good." The mother just shook her head sadly and dropped a few dollars in the case before hurrying along. The scene stirred something in Trump that he hadn't felt in a while, a mixture of curiosity and concern that cut through his usual businesslike demeanor. Despite the protests of his security team, he began walking toward the musician. People on the street started noticing, phones coming out to record the unusual sight of the former president approaching a street performer. The violin case told its own story. A few scattered dollar bills and coins, a faded photograph tucked into the lid showing a younger version of the musician standing proudly on stage with an orchestra, and a small handwritten sign that read simply, "Music is life's greatest gift. Thank you for listening." Looking closer, Trump recognized the musician. The realization hit him like a physical force. This was James Chen, once a celebrated violinist whose performances he'd attended at the New York Philharmonic years ago. Trump had even hosted a charity gala where Chen had been the featured performer. What could have happened to bring such a talented artist to this point? The crowd around them grew larger as people recognized Trump, but for once, he didn't seem to notice the attention. His focus was entirely on the musician and the story unfolding before him. Chen continued playing, lost in his music, unaware that his audience now included one of the most recognizable figures in the world. As the last notes of Ave Maria faded into the evening air, Chen finally opened his eyes. For a moment, he seemed startled by the size of the crowd that had gathered. Then his gaze met Trump's, and a flash of recognition crossed his weathered face. He lowered his violin slowly, his hands trembling slightly, whether from the cold or emotion, it wasn't clear. The street had grown unusually quiet. Even the traffic seemed to have hushed. In that moment, something remarkable was happening on a New York City street corner, a genuine human connection forming between two men from vastly different worlds. What happened next would not only change Chen's life, but would remind everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful stories unfold in the most unexpected places. The crowd held its breath as Trump took a step forward. "I remember you," he said, his voice softer than his usual public tone. "New York Philharmonic, 2015. You played Tchaikovsky that night." Chen's eyes widened with surprise, not just that Trump remembered, but that he remembered the specific performance. "Yes," Chen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The violin concerto in D major." His hands clutched his violin a little tighter, as if drawing strength from the instrument that had been his constant companion for over 50 years. A slight tremor ran through his fingers, not from nervousness, but from the evening chill that had settled into his joints. Trump noticed the tremor and, without hesitation, shrugged off his coat. Before his security detail could react, he'd stepped forward and draped it over Chen's shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so human, that several onlookers gasped. Someone in the crowd started recording with their phone, while others simply watched in stunned silence. "Tell me what happened," Trump said, not as a command but as a genuine question. He gestured to a nearby stone planter, suggesting they sit. For a moment, Chen hesitated, looking around at the growing crowd. But there was something in Trump's expression, an unexpected kindness, that made him nod. As they sat, Chen carefully placed his violin in its case. His hands moved over it with the tenderness of a parent tucking in a child. Then he began to speak, his voice growing stronger as he shared his story. He told Trump about his wife, Lee, who'd been diagnosed with aggressive cancer 3 years ago. How the medical bills had quickly overwhelmed their savings, despite having insurance. "We had to choose," Chen said, his voice catching, "between treatments that might give us more time together or keeping our home." His eyes grew distant as he remembered. Lee insisted on selling the apartment, said she wouldn't let me give up playing just to pay bills. But after he paused, collecting himself. "After she passed, I couldn't keep up with even the smaller apartment's rent on my orchestra pension." The crowd had grown larger, but they maintained a respectful distance, sensing they were witnessing something profound. A young street vendor quietly handed out free coffee to people standing nearby, everyone wanting to stay and see what would happen next. Chen continued his story, explaining how arthritis had forced him to retire from the orchestra earlier than planned. How he tried teaching violin lessons, but between grief and mounting bills, he'd eventually lost his teaching studio too. "But I couldn't stop playing," he said, gesturing to his violin. "Lee always said music was healing, so I came here. Some days are better than others, but at least I'm still playing." Trump listened intently, his usual rapid-fire speech patterns nowhere in sight. He noticed how Chen kept his back straight despite his circumstances, how his clothes were threadbare but immaculately clean. This wasn't a man looking for pity. This was an artist who'd been knocked down by life but refused to give up his dignity. A cool breeze swept through the street, rustling fallen leaves around their feet. In the distance, a siren wailed, and the usual New York City traffic continued its steady rhythm. But right here, in this moment, time seemed to stand still as two men from vastly different worlds shared a simple human connection. Trump leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Those who knew him well would have recognized this look. It was the same one he got just before making a major business decision. He glanced at Chen's violin case, then back at the musician's face, seeing not just the struggle of one man, but a story that reflected something larger about human resilience and the power of art to sustain the spirit. The sun had dipped lower behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The streetlights were coming on one by one, creating pools of warm light in the gathering dusk. No one in the crowd could have guessed what Trump was thinking or what he would do next. But everyone who was there that evening knew they were watching something extraordinary unfold, a moment when titles and status fell away, leaving just two human beings sharing a bench on a New York City street corner. The street lamps cast a warm glow over the scene as Trump reached into his jacket pocket. The crowd watched, phones still recording, as he pulled out not his usual gold-plated pen, but a simple black one he used in a meeting earlier. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands as if weighing more than just the pen itself. "Play something else for me," Trump said suddenly, surprising everyone. Chen looked startled but nodded slowly. His hands, warmer now from Trump's coat, moved to lift the violin from its case. As he positioned it under his chin, a hint of the old performer's confidence returned to his posture. Chen chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, adapted for violin. The melody floated up into the evening air, weaving between the buildings and over the crowd. Trump closed his eyes, listening. A small girl in a puffy pink coat started swaying to the music, her mother's hands on her shoulders. Even the usually stoic security detail seemed moved. As Chen played, more people gathered. A hot dog vendor stopped his cart nearby, listening while still serving customers. Office workers on their way home paused, briefcases in hand. A group of teenagers lowered their phones, the music catching their attention more than the chance to record a viral moment. Trump opened his eyes and watched Chen play. He saw how the musician's fingers, despite their arthritis, still moved with incredible precision. How his whole body seemed to come alive with the music. This wasn't just someone playing for spare change. This was an artist sharing his gift with the world, regardless of his circumstances. The final notes of the song faded away, leaving behind a moment of perfect silence. Then Trump did something that made his security team exchange nervous glances. He stood up and walked to the violin case, looking at the old photograph tucked inside. It showed Chen performing at Lincoln Center, the same dignity evident in his younger face. Trump pulled out his checkbook, not for show, but with purpose. The crowd murmured as he started writing, but what they didn't expect was what he did next. He turned to one of his security team and asked for their phone. Making a call right there on the street wasn't his usual style, but something about this situation demanded immediate action. "David? It's Donald," he said into the phone, his voice carrying in the unusual quiet that had fallen over the street. "Remember that chamber music series we discussed for the winter season? I've found your violinist." He paused, listening. "Yes, right now. On the street outside the tower. James Chen. Yes, that James Chen." Chen's hands began trembling again, but this time not from the cold. Trump handed back the phone and turned to face him. The crowd had grown even larger, with people standing on tiptoes at the back to see what was happening. A delivery boy on his bike stopped in the middle of the street, pizza getting cold in his carrier as he watched the scene unfold. Trump held out the check, but didn't let go when Chen reached for it. "This is for a year's rent," he said quietly, though his voice carried to the crowd. "But the real opportunity is what's coming next. David Kent from Lincoln Center wants you to audition next week. Not for charity. He needs a violinist of your caliber for their new chamber series." The look on Chen's face was something none of the onlookers would ever forget. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the look of a man who'd been given back his dignity, his purpose. Trump pulled over one of his advisors and instructed them to take down Chen's information and help him with the paperwork for the audition. As this was happening, a young boy pushed through the crowd, holding out a crumpled dollar bill toward Chen's violin case. His mother tried to pull him back, embarrassed, but Trump knelt down to the boy's level. "You want to help the musician?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Then save that dollar for when you come see him play at Lincoln Center this winter." The boy's face lit up, and something about that moment, the hope in the child's eyes mirroring the hope in Chen's, seemed to touch everyone watching. This wasn't just about money or music anymore. It was about second chances, about recognizing the value in each person, about the unexpected moments that can change a life. The news spread through the crowd like a wave, person to person, phone to phone. Some were already posting videos online, but surprisingly, many just stood there, taking in the moment with their own eyes rather than through a screen. The story was too good, too human to be reduced to just another viral clip. Chen stood holding the check, his withered hands shaking slightly. He looked at it, then at Trump, then back at the check again, as if afraid it might disappear. An older woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes, nudging her husband, who pretended something had gotten in his eye too. The hot dog vendor had stopped selling completely, his cart temporarily forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. I don't know what to say," Chen finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. Trump surprised everyone by chuckling, a genuine warm sound that made him seem more approachable than his usual public appearances. "Don't say anything," he replied. "Just play something happy this time." Chen tucked the check carefully into his pocket and lifted his violin once more. This time, he chose The Four Seasons by Vivaldi. The Spring Movement. The piece burst forth with joy and energy, his bow dancing across the strings with newfound vigor. The music seemed to match the mood of the moment perfectly, full of hope and new beginnings. A couple of street dancers who happened to be passing by started moving to the music, their impromptu performance adding to the celebratory atmosphere. The young boy who had offered his dollar earlier was bouncing on his toes, his mother now smiling instead of trying to pull him away. Even some of Trump's security team were tapping their feet, though they tried to maintain their professional composure. As Chen played, Trump's assistant was already making calls, setting things in motion. She arranged for a car to pick Chen up the next morning, scheduled meetings with the Lincoln Center staff, and found a suitable apartment that would accept Trump's check as a year's advance payment. The efficiency of it all was impressive, but what stood out was how she treated Chen, not as a charity case, but as an honored artist who deserved respect. The temperature had dropped further, but nobody seemed to notice. The street had transformed into something magical, a place where second chances were real and dreams could come back to life. A nearby coffee shop owner came out with cups of hot coffee for Chen and Trump, refusing to accept payment. "This one's on the house," he said, beaming. "Best thing I've seen in my 20 years on this street." Trump's phone buzzed continuously with messages, but for once, he ignored them all. Instead, he watched Chen play, occasionally nodding in time with the music. His expression was thoughtful, almost nostalgic, as if remembering something from long ago. One of his advisors tried to remind him about his next appointment, but Trump waved him off. "Some things are more important," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The sun had set completely now, and the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky. Someone had brought out their phone's flashlight, and others followed suit, creating a soft glow around the impromptu concert. The effect was stunning. Chen playing his violin in a circle of light, surrounded by a crowd of strangers who no longer felt like strangers. A police officer who'd stopped to see what was causing the gathering ended up staying, helping to manage the crowd that had spilled slightly into the street. But there was no need for crowd control. Everyone was too caught up in the moment to cause any trouble. The officer even helped direct traffic around the scene, ensuring the magical moment could continue undisturbed. As the music soared to its finale, a small group of restaurant workers from a nearby diner had gathered during their break, still wearing their aprons. One of them whispered to another about how his own grandfather had been a musician back home and how this reminded him of those stories. These little connections were happening all through the crowd, strangers sharing memories, dreams, and hopes inspired by what they were witnessing. The piece came to an end, and this time the applause was thunderous. Chen lowered his violin, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Trump stood up, signaling that the evening was drawing to a close. But before he left, he did something that no one expected. He pulled out his business card and wrote his private number on the back. "For when you need anything before the audition," he said quietly, handing it to Chen. "And I mean anything." The next morning dawned bright and clear over New York City. The spot where Chen had played was now just another busy corner, but something had changed. The hot dog vendor who'd witnessed everything was telling the story to his regular customers. The coffee shop had put up a small sign reading "Home of the Musical Miracle," and people were already coming in asking about it. Chen arrived at his usual spot early that morning, but this time in a clean black car sent by Trump's team. He was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, but there was something different about him, a straightness in his spine, a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The driver helped him carry his violin case, treating it with the respect usually reserved for precious cargo. The morning commuters did double takes as they recognized him from the videos that had spread overnight. A construction worker called out, "Hey, violin man. Good luck today." Chen waved back, smiling. His hands were steady as he opened his violin case, not to play on the street this time, but to head to his first meeting at Lincoln Center. Trump's assistant had arranged everything meticulously. First was a meeting with the housing agent to secure an apartment, a modest but clean one-bedroom in a good neighborhood. Then off to Lincoln Center, where the artistic director was waiting. Word had spread through the music community, and several old colleagues were there to greet Chen, some with tears in their eyes as they hugged him. Back at Trump Tower, the lobby staff were fielding calls from news organizations wanting to cover the story. Trump had left instructions, no press unless Chen wanted it. This wasn't about publicity, it was about doing the right thing. The security team who'd witnessed everything had already spread the word among their colleagues, and the story was becoming something of a legend. The young boy who'd offered his dollar bill returned with his mother that morning, hoping to see Chen again. When they learned about what had happened, the boy's face lit up. "Mom, can we really go see him at Lincoln Center?" he asked. His mother smiled, already planning to save up for tickets. The coffee shop owner overheard and offered the boy a hot chocolate on the house, starting what would become a tradition of kindness inspired by the previous night's events. At the Lincoln Center, Chen walked through the familiar halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Old photos on the walls showed him in his prime, performing with the orchestra. A cleaning lady recognized him and rushed over to give him a hug. She'd been working there for 30 years and remembered how he always treated everyone with kindness, from the conductor to the custodial staff. The audition wasn't really an audition at all. David Kent, the artistic director, just wanted to hear Chen play once to confirm what he already knew. As Chen began to perform, office staff stopped their work and gathered in the doorways to listen. The music filled the rehearsal room, then spilled out into the hallway, drawing more people in. Meanwhile, Trump was in his office, dealing with his usual busy schedule. But he kept checking his phone for updates about Chen. His staff noticed how he smiled each time a message came in. One of his oldest employees remarked that she hadn't seen him this invested in something personal for a long time. The story started appearing on social media, but not in the usual sensational way. People were sharing it with thoughtful comments about kindness, second chances, and the power of music. The videos weren't focused on Trump's celebrity or politics. They captured the human moment when two people from different worlds connected through compassion and understanding. Back in the neighborhood, the spot where Chen used to play had become something of a landmark. Street musicians started gathering there, hoping some of the magic would rub off on them. The hot dog vendor noticed more people stopping to listen to the music now, and he started keeping track of all the new musicians' stories, sharing them with interested customers. Chen finished his piece at Lincoln Center, and the small crowd that had gathered burst into applause. David Kent walked over and instead of offering feedback, simply handed him a contract. "Welcome home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Chen looked at the contract, then at his violin, then out the window at the city skyline. He thought about how much had changed in just 24 hours, all because someone took the time to stop and listen. The weeks flew by like pages turning in a storybook. Chen's new apartment was small but cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The living room was just big enough for his violin practice, and the neighbors didn't mind. They considered it a privilege to hear him play. Every morning he would stand by the window, violin in hand, and practice as the sun rose over the city. Word had spread through the music community about Chen's comeback. His old students started finding their way back to him, one by one. A music store owner in Brooklyn offered him space for teaching, remembering how Chen had once helped his daughter develop her talent. The teaching room wasn't fancy, just a small space with a couple of chairs and a music stand, but to Chen, it felt like coming home. Trump kept his word about staying in touch. His private number wasn't just for show. He actually answered when Chen called with questions about the upcoming performance series. Sometimes they talked about music, sometimes about life. The conversations were never long, but they were genuine. Trump's staff noticed how he'd always take these calls, even during busy days. The little boy who'd offered his dollar bill became a regular at Chen's teaching space. His mother had mentioned how her son couldn't stop talking about the violin after that night. When Chen heard this, he offered to teach the boy for free. "Someone once gave me a second chance," he explained to the mother. "Now it's my turn to pass it on." The coffee shop near Trump Tower had become a gathering spot for local musicians. They put up a small photo of Chen playing on that fateful evening, and it became something of a good luck charm. Street performers would touch it before going out to play, hoping for their own miracle. The shop owner started offering free coffee to street musicians, creating a warm haven during cold days. Chen's preparation for the Lincoln Center series became the talk of the classical music world. Young musicians would stop by his teaching space just to watch him practice. They didn't see a former street performer, they saw a master returning to his craft. Chen took time to share stories with them, not about his hardships, but about the joy of music and the importance of never giving up. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at Chen's apartment. Inside was a ticket to his upcoming performance, along with a handwritten note. It was from the police officer who had helped manage the crowd that evening. He had bought tickets for his whole family, writing that he wanted his children to see what real dedication looked like. The hot dog vendor had expanded his cart into a small kiosk, adding coffee and sandwiches to his menu. He'd named it the Musician's Corner and would tell Chen's story to anyone who asked about the name. Regular customers started leaving their spare change in a tip jar labeled "For the Music," which he would distribute to street performers at the end of each day. Trump's security team had also been changed by the experience. They started paying more attention to the street performers they passed each day, sometimes stopping to listen when their duty allowed. One of them even started taking guitar lessons, inspired by how music had bridged such a wide gap between two different lives. The rehearsals at Lincoln Center became events in themselves. Other musicians would find excuses to be in the rehearsal hall when Chen was practicing. There was something special about watching someone play not just with skill, but with the joy of someone who had found their way back to what they loved most. Chen kept Trump's coat, the one he'd been given that cold evening. He had it carefully cleaned and offered to return it, but Trump told him to keep it. It hung in Chen's apartment as a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes in life come from unexpected moments of kindness. The neighborhood had changed too. More people stopped to listen to street musicians now, really listen, not just hurry by. The spot where Chen used to play had become a favorite for new performers, each adding their own story to the place's growing legend. Sometimes, people would leave notes instead of money, sharing how the music had touched their lives. The night of Chen's debut performance at Lincoln Center arrived with a buzz of excitement in the air. The concert hall gleamed under soft lights, and every seat was filled. In the front row sat the young boy who'd offered his dollar bill, now dressed in his Sunday best, clutching a program with both hands. His mother sat beside him, beaming with pride as if Chen were family. Trump arrived quietly through a side entrance, choosing to avoid any fanfare. He took his seat in the middle of the audience, not in the VIP section. The hot dog vendor was there too, having closed his cart early for the first time in 15 years. The police officer who'd helped that night sat with his family, explaining to his children how he'd witnessed the moment that led to this evening. Backstage, Chen stood in his dressing room, looking at himself in the mirror. He wore a new suit, simple but elegant. On the dressing table lay Trump's business card, worn at the edges from being carried everywhere. Next to it sat a small frame containing the dollar bill from that young boy, Chen's first payment from his street performing days, which he kept as a reminder. The cleaning lady from Lincoln Center peeked in to wish him luck, tears in her eyes as she remembered the days when he'd been a regular performer here. Chen hugged her, remembering how she'd always left a fresh flower in his dressing room before performances years ago. Today, she'd done it again. A single white rose in a small vase. As Chen walked onto the stage, the applause was deafening. But he wasn't looking at the crowd yet. His eyes were closed, his mind going back to that street corner, to the moment when everything changed. He opened his eyes and saw the faces in the audience, the coffee shop owner, his former students, the construction worker who'd wished him luck, all mixed in with New York's elite music lovers. The first notes filled the concert hall, and something magical happened. The music wasn't just beautiful, it carried with it every emotion, every struggle, every moment of hope from Chen's journey. People in the audience found themselves holding hands with strangers, moved by the pure joy and resilience in every note. During intermission, Trump overheard two elderly ladies talking. You know, one said, "I walked past him every day when he played on the street. I never stopped to listen. What a fool I was." Her friend patted her hand and replied, "But you're here now." Sometimes it takes a while to learn how to really listen. The second half of the concert was even more powerful than the first. Chen played pieces he performed on the street, but now they soared in the perfect acoustics of the concert hall. The young boy who'd become his student watched with wide eyes, seeing his teacher transform into something magnificent on stage. At the end of the performance, the standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. Chen bowed, then did something unexpected. He pointed to various people in the audience who'd been part of his journey, acknowledging each one. When he pointed to Trump, the applause grew even louder, but not for the reasons one might expect. This wasn't about politics or celebrity, it was about human kindness and its power to change lives. After the concert, a small celebration was held backstage. The hot dog vendor had brought some of his famous hot dogs, serving them alongside the fancy catered food. Nobody minded, it felt right, this mixing of Chen's two worlds. Trump stayed in the background, watching as Chen was surrounded by well-wishers and music lovers. Later that night, after everyone had left, Chen returned to the street corner where it all began. He took out his violin and played one last piece, not for money or recognition, but as a thank you to the city that had both broken and rebuilt him. A few late-night pedestrians stopped to listen, not knowing the full story, but feeling that they were witnessing something special. As the final notes faded into the night air, a gentle snow began to fall. Chen packed up his violin for the last time as a street performer, but not with sadness. Tomorrow, he would return to teaching, to performing, to sharing his gift with the world. His story had become more than just a tale of personal triumph. It had become a reminder that in a world that often seems cold and indifferent, moments of genuine human connection can still change everything.